Okay, today's speaker is Nathaniel Stinnett. He's founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. He has some fascinating things to share with us today, and the title of his talk is Modern Environmental Politics: How Big Data and Behavioral Science Are Transforming Environmental Political Power. Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining us. I'll mute myself and it's...
All right. Thank you, Dan. And thank you to all that you have on a regular basis. And thank you for just dedicating your time and energy to learning about new and important things. As Dan mentioned, I'm going to present for about 20-25 minutes, and then we will have time for a robust question and answer session. Because a lot of the stuff that we do at the Environmental Voter Project and a lot of this sort of cutting edge data and behavioral science work that's going on in politics right now could be discussed for hours and hours and hours, and we don't have hours and hours and hours. What I plan to do in this presentation is discuss the things that I think are important and discuss them at enough depth that it might make you curious to ask questions about more things. So please forgive me if it seems like I am just glancing over a few things. Understand that it's by design. There are some things that I could really drill down into detail on, but I don't want to spend all this time talking about the things I find interesting. I want to spend this time talking about the things that you all find interesting. So please, 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 if there's something you want to learn more about that you hear me discuss in passing, ask about it in the question and answer session, and we will go into plenty of interesting detail. So what I'm going to talk about today is our work at the Environmental Voter Project, but also it's really going to be only as background or scaffolding for a broader theme that I think is extraordinarily important that's going on in modern politics right now, and that is how data science and behavioral science are driving not just how political campaigns are run, but how policy is made. Now, we view all of this through an environmental lens at the Environmental Voter Project, but hopefully you won't just be learning about what our nonprofit does, but rather about this general broader trend that is so crucially important to modern politics. So let's get started. The Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that just does one thing. We find environmentalists who aren't voting, and we turn them into better voters. That's it. We do not endorse candidates. We do not lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate change or the environment. We are not in the mind-changing business. We are in the behavior-changing business. We're simply finding people who already deeply care about the environment yet aren't voting, and we nudge their behavior into turning them into better voters. And I hope that this session won't only be interesting for those of you who care about climate or the environment, but it will be an interesting peek at a lot of important stuff that's going on in politics. So, one of the biggest problems we have in the environmental movement right now, one of the biggest reasons we aren't getting more leadership on progressive environmental policy, is that voters do not prioritize environmental issues. This is obviously not the only reason, but it is one of the biggest reasons we don't have as much leadership on progressive environmental issues. And when I say voters don't prioritize environmental issues, looking back starting in 2016, the last presidential election, only 2% of likely voters listed climate or the environment as their #1 priority. And another 2% listed it as their second highest priority. My guess is, whether you deeply care about climate or the environment or not, probably most of you noticed we had 3 presidential debates in 2016, and there wasn't a single question asked about climate change. It wasn't asked about once. This is why. This is why. Media and politics is a marketplace just like any other marketplace. And when voters aren't supplying demand for a particular product, there's no reason for politicians or the media to supply it. And I want to be very clear here. There's a big difference between voters preferring environmental leadership and prioritizing it. You are all probably very familiar with polls that say, oh, 70% of Americans believe that there's human-caused climate change, or 60% of Americans want the federal government to act on climate. Yeah, but if it's their 20th most important priority, that's not going to change anything. It's not going to change anything. Voters' priorities are what drive policymaking, not their preferences. And you'll see in 2016, it was way, way down the list of voter priorities. Fortunately, things have been changing over the past 3.5 years. In 2018, this is a slightly apples to oranges comparison, but people who voted in the 2018 midterms, so midterm voters are different from presidential election voters, so it is an apples to oranges comparison. 7% of them listed climate or the so from 2 to 7%. Not a perfect apples to apples comparison, but still some significant movement there. And that was 1.5 years ago. In the intervening 1.5 years, at least before this pandemic broke out, where everything got mixed up, at the beginning of the year, there were some polls showing that as many as 10% of likely voters in the upcoming presidential election might list climate or the environment as their top priority. That's great movement. But I would suggest to you, for those of us who care about climate and the environment, we can't pat ourselves on the back for too long, because look where healthcare is, look where immigration is, look where the economy and jobs are. Politicians go where the votes are. And when 60, 65% of voters, 70, 75% care about things more than they care about climate and the environment, no one is going to end up spending their political capital on climate and the environment. No matter how many scientists scream that it's an existential crisis, politicians are not going to spend their political capital on something that only 7% of voters, they're not. And here's why. And if there's only one thing that you take away from this presentation today, let it be this. Who you vote for is secret. But whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record, whether you vote or not. Anybody can go and look it up in Branford Town Hall, who voted in the last midterm or the last local election. It's public record. And so what that means is campaigns only target likely voters. Let's say Dan is running for governor of Connecticut, and for better or for worse, Dan hires me to be his campaign manager. And we know, because it's public record, who has a history of actually showing up and voting for gubernatorial elections in Connecticut. Well, Dan only has a limited amount of time and a limited amount of money to get 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November. That's his only goal. Do you think he's going to bother talking to people who aren't registered to vote? No way. Do you think he's going to bother talking to people who only vote in presidential elections? No way. He's only going to talk to people who have a history of showing up for gubernatorial elections and local elections and things like that. Maybe if he's literally just like bathing in excess cash, he might talk to some people who show up for presidentials. But he really needs to figure out what his market is and talk to them. And of course, politicians do the same thing. And because politicians really only talk to people who are likely to vote in the election they care about, who do you think they poll? Well, they only poll the likely voters. Dan would fire me in a second if I came back to him and I said, hey, Dan, we figured out what all of the people who aren't going to vote in your election care about. That's not what he cares about. Just like Starbucks doesn't care about you if you don't drink coffee. Just like Ford Motor Company doesn't try to do market research with 3-year-olds. Ford can't sell cars to 3-year-olds. Ford doesn't care what 3-year-olds think. And politicians don't really care that much about the priorities of non-voters. They only care about the priorities of voters. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's something that we accept in every other aspect of our lives. There is a market for our product, and those are the people we need to think about and worry about. Well, politicians are focused on winning and losing elections. And so because whether you vote or not is public record, they are always going to try to figure out what likely voters care about. People with a history of voting in those elections, not what unlikely voters care about. And so this is pretty bad news for the climate movement and the environmental movement, because those polls I showed to you, there's nothing secret about them. Anybody can do a poll and anybody can figure out who's likely to vote and who isn't based off public voter files and see that people who have a history of voting do not list climate and the environment as a very high priority. Now, I promise to you that this isn't going to all be bad news, this presentation. There's going to be a lot of good news, and hopefully you'll leave with a feeling of optimism. It turns out that even though there aren't many voters who prioritize climate and the environment, the good news is there are a lot of non-voters that prioritize climate and the environment. The good news is there are actually tens of millions of non-voters who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their #1 priority over all others. And this is why at the Environmental Voter Project, we don't try to change people's minds. We don't talk to the voters who don't care about climate and try to persuade them to change their opinions. No, we find these non-voters who are already with us and try to nudge their behavior. And just to give you an idea of what this turnout problem is, in the 2014 midterm elections, 44% of registered voters voted. Only 21% of environmentalists who are registered to vote showed up. A huge, huge discrepancy. 2016 presidential election was a little bit better. 69% of registered voters voted. A little bit over 50% of environmentalists who are registered to vote voted. 2018 midterm, much, much better. First of all, we should note that the 2018 midterms, that was the highest turnout rate of a midterm election going back all the way to 1914. 1914, an election that took place 3-4 months after the war to end all wars broke out. So people were pretty focused on politics. That was the last time there was turnout as high, or a turnout rate as high, as the 2018 midterm. 57% of registered voters voted. Environmentalists did a lot better, 53%. But again, I'd suggest to you, for those of us who care about these issues, we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back, because we're struggling to just get up to a point that is the national average of turnout. Believe me when I tell you, there are some issue constituency groups out there that vote a hell of a lot better than the national average. One example, people who really care about gun rights. If you really care about guns, if you're an NRA member, you vote like it's your job. You vote even if it's for library trustee or dog catcher. You vote for everything. They're not struggling to hit the national average. They're up at 75, 80% turnout in elections. They punch above their weight, and the environmental movement is punching below its weight. This turnout problem is what we are trying to address at the Environmental Voter Project, because we think we live in a moment in time in this like crazy post-truth environment where it is increasingly hard to get people to change their minds. It's increasingly hard to get people to change their opinions. It's easier, I won't claim it's easy, but it's easier to change their behavior. And it's cheaper to change their behavior. So what I'm going to drill into next is how we find these non-voting environmentalists and then nudge their behavior and turn them into more likely voters. Because to give you an idea of how large this pool of potential political power is, we identified 15.8 million environmentalists who are already registered to vote who didn't vote in that 2014 election. We identified 10.1 million who didn't vote in the 2016 presidential. 10.1 million. They were already registered to vote. They just didn't walk out their door on election day in a presidential election that was decided by 77,000 votes. This is a huge number of already persuaded, dyed-in-the-wool environmentalists who just ain't voting. All right, so how do we do it? We use a lot of tools that I think are important for you to understand, not just if you care about the work that we do or care about climate or the environment, but because if you want to fully understand where modern politics is, these tools are being used right now as we speak by sophisticated presidential and US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns. The first is we use data analytics and predictive modeling to individually identify who these non-voting environmentalists are. And I'm going to go into some detail on this. Second, once we've found these people, we leverage the latest behavioral science to change their behavior. So once we find someone who deeply cares about the environment, at that point, we don't need to waste our time educating them about anything. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that was the best way to get them to vote. And then third, habit reinforcement. The Environmental Voter Project is not in the election winning game. We are in the electorate changing game. And what I mean by that is we know that nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing elections. So if you make more environmental voters, politicians are always going to follow. And so whenever there's an election, local, state, federal, using it as an opportunity, as an intervention point to change people's behavior and turn them into better voters. So that after 2, 3, 4 years in a state, the number of environmentalists who are actually voting will be 50, 60, 70% higher than what it was before. Okay, very quickly, how do we do it? You don't need to read all of these words. I don't want you to cross your eyes. I'm going to quickly go through this, and then if you're interested during the question and answer period, we can drill down in a bit more detail. What we do and what presidential and US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns do is we build a predictive model. And here's how it works. We start by polling tens of thousands of people per state, enormous numbers of people. But we will only ask them one question. We'll call them up or we'll text them or we'll get them on an online panel and we'll say, Dan, what's your number one most important political priority? Oh, great, thanks, boom. And then we call the next person. Jenna, what's your number one most important political priority? Tom, what's yours? Mike, what's yours? Sarah, what's yours? And we go through all these people and we get all this data. And let's say we're doing it in Connecticut. After we call 20,000 people, let's say listed some environmental issue as their number one priority. It's then the easiest thing in the world to work with data scientists and start seeing, okay, what do these people have in common? What do these people look like? And because there's a lot of data on voter files and a lot of data that is publicly available, don't worry, we don't do any like dark stuff like Cambridge Analytica. We don't steal any data or anything like that, but we work with vendors who have publicly available data. And these data scientists start to see, oh, okay, of the people in this poll who we reached, we know who they are in the voter file. This climate and the environment as their top priority. What else do we know about them? And they can start looking and they can say, oh, look, people who we know are forestry employees were 11 times as more likely than the average to list climate or the environment as their top priority. Ooh, Latinx were 7 times as likely. Ooh, basketball fans were more likely than baseball, football, and hockey fans. We find all these weird little things. And these are just examples. Bank here. But what we end up doing is we find these combinations of behavioral and consumer data points that allow us to say things like, wow, if you are a Latina basketball fan between the ages of 25 and 30 living in Stamford, Connecticut, and you bought a Volvo between 8 and 98% likelihood of listing climate is your top priority. And we find like all these weird little nuggets like that, all these patterns and correlations. And using that, we can work with data scientists to extrapolate out to the entire voter file in a state. and we can start trying to predict how everybody in the state, how likely they are to list climate and the environment as their top priority. Here's an example. Here's a list of all the people in the Florida voter file. And as you can see, there are almost 425,000 who only have like an 8% likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their number one priority over all other issues. But there are millions and millions who are like 4 times the state average. And when we are able to assign these scores, these probability scores to everybody in a state, literally every individual in a state, we can then test and retest and retest until this model, this predictive model, helps us really, really accurately define by name and street address who all the super environmentalists are in a state. And then remember what I said before, whether you vote or not is public record. You don't need a data scientist to tell you which of these environmentalists are good voters and which aren't. Now, what I just went through is a very sort of convoluted process, but I think a very good way to understand it is by making an analogy to something that maybe you have more experience. Life insurance. If you've ever bought life insurance, the first step is to give them a lot of information. You say, oh, okay, this is how much I drink, this is how much I smoke, this is my medical history, this is how much I exercise. Yes, I like to dive off cliffs. Like, you give them all this information so that they can build a risk profile for you. And they compare it with other people. And they essentially put together a predictive model, just like we do. They don't call it that. They call it an actuarial table. And it's a little bit different from a predictive model, but not that different. And if they're off by a little bit, like, the entire insurance industry fails. Well, we have the same level of precision, but rather than trying to predict how long people are going to live, we're trying to predict who are the people who care this much about climate and the environment. And to be clear, this is the same stuff that presidential campaigns are doing right now. They have assigned a score to every single one of you as individuals, telling them how likely you are to care about this issue or that issue, how likely you are to support Joe Biden or Donald Trump, how likely you are to do a whole bunch of things. This is the individualized way that campaigns target now. You might remember soccer moms in 2004 and NASCAR dads in 2008. Well, big data killed the soccer mom. Political campaigns don't target by demographic group. They target on an individualized basis. And then what that allows us to do is literally map out where all these non-voting environmentalists are. These are all the environmentalists who didn't vote in Cambridge. Do we know for a fact with 100% certainty that all these people list climate as their number one priority? No, but we have like 92, 93% certainty. It's extraordinarily accurate. These are all the non-voting environmentalists in, I can't see the top of the thing, but somewhere in New Hampshire, Hanover, maybe Concord. This is Portland, Maine. This is Philadelphia. This is Phoenix. We literally know these people by name and street address. We can send them letters. We can call them. Okay, I'm going to move ahead. I'm getting a little bit behind, and I want to leave enough time for Q&A. So let me get to the last section here. Once we have identified these non-voting environmentalists, how do we turn them into better voters? Because remember, if we have this high level of certainty that these people, we know they don't vote, and we're 90 to 95% certain that they don't just care about climate and the environment, it's their number one priority, well, that opens up an enormous realm of behavioral psychology techniques that we can use that actually do with the environment. As I said before, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies now if it was the best way to get these people to vote. And what we have found at the Environmental Voter Project, and what a lot of political campaigns and political scientists are now finding, not to mention behavioral economists and behavioral psychologists, is what you see under that box that says messaging there. The best way to get someone to take an action, whether it be walking out the door to vote, whether it be exercising more often, whether it be changing how you eat or vaccinating your children, is not to try to rationally convince them of the importance of voting. The one thing we never do with the Environmental Voter Project, oddly enough, is talk about the environment. Because if you find an environmentalist who isn't voting and then try to rationally convince them that it's important to vote because they care about the environment, it might make sense to our logical heads, but it never works. Hundreds and hundreds of randomized control trials have proven it does not work. Instead, what works is what behavioral scientists call expressive choice theory rather than rational choice theory. And again, I can get into this more in the Q&A if you're interested, but essentially what it means is instead of viewing people as rational beings in a marketplace, we view them as societal beings. We view them as people who have all of these social pressures that they interact with and react with on a daily basis and try to take advantage of that. So let me give you some examples. I've never met any of you. You've never met me. But chances are you want me to think that you're a smart person. I want you to think that I'm a smart person. It's something about our personalities that we carry with us every day. And this is a really important thing that we can buy into. And next time you go into the doctor's office, hopefully we'll be able to leave our houses soon, look at the wall and you'll see the entire public health field now has stopped trying to rationally convince people to vaccinate their children. And instead, they have these really almost juvenile normative statements on the wall saying things like, all smart parents vaccinate their children. Because we know behavioral scientists are smart. I'll give you another example. Unless you're a sociopath, you probably want to be thought of as an honest and trustworthy person. And so what many campaigns do now, if you've ever volunteered, you've probably done this yourself, is all they do is they get a voter to sign a promise that they're going to vote on election day. And then the campaign mails that promise back to them. Why? Because you don't want to be in a conversation with someone saying, Dan, you've got to vote because your one vote's really important. I mean, we all know our one vote is never going to is never going to determine the outcome of an election. It's incredibly rare. No, that pledge is important because it allows you to have a different conversation. It allows you to say, Dan, I just want to remind you, on May 3rd, you made a promise that you were going to vote. And on Tuesday is your opportunity to follow through on that promise. It's important to be an honest and trustworthy person, right? I can get into some of the more techniques we use if you're interested in the Q&A. As an organization, we have thousands of volunteers around the country who canvass and call and text and mail and send digital ads to these non-voting environmentalists. Very quickly, one example that people usually find interesting, we've done some studies that show that you see in presidential elections, 89% of people say that they vote. After the fact, when we actually look them up on voter files, only 59% of them actually voted. In primary elections, it's a huge discrepancy. And so this is another societal norm that we like to buy into. We know that everybody, even if you're a bad voter, you want to be known as a good voter. And so we will often take advantage of that. One of the most aggressive things we do is we send people letters reminding them that we know when they vote or not. This rubs some people the wrong way, but when you get a letter in the mail saying, hey, you skipped the last 3 elections, we know it's important to you to be a good voter, it drives turnout through the roof. Through the roof. Okay, I'm going to very quickly go give you some examples of how much this increases turnout, and I'm just going to breeze through it so we can get to Q&A. In the 2018 midterms, we were in 6 states at the Environmental Voter Project. We know from randomized control trials that we increased turnout 2.7 percentage points over the control group. If 2.7 doesn't sound like a lot to you, talk to Hillary Clinton. These are big, big numbers in this business. We were solely responsible for adding almost 59,000 brand new environmental voters who otherwise wouldn't have shown up. In 2019, we expanded from these 6 states. So we started in these 6 states 3 years ago. We're only 3 years old. We expanded into another 6 states. So now we're in these 12 states. Remember what I said about habit reinforcement. 2019, there were no big, sexy elections going on in 2019. But we still we're active in 613 local and state elections. Because if you're trying to change people's voting behavior, talking to them every 2 or 4 years when they have a big federal election just ain't going to cut it. And so whenever these non-voting environmentalists have an election, we view it as an intervention opportunity to change their voting behavior. We have over 3,000 volunteers who contacted voters the following ways in 2019. And in 2020, by the end of 2019, we had graduated over 250,000 people out of our program, just in our original 6 states. What I mean by graduated is these people, after getting over and over again these cutting-edge behavioral science interventions, these people had voted in local, state, and federal elections. They had become such good voters that, like, even if you were running for library trustee, this person would show up and vote. And we were only targeting them because they were truly awful voters. Now, we don't have graduate numbers for our new 6 states because we've only been there for about 7 or 8 months. As I said before, we view every election as an intervention opportunity. We've already contacted close to 2.4 million voters this year. We're contacting people in the spring and the summer. We're obviously going to be contacting people during the presidential general. I can tell you about that more if you're interested in the Q&A. And I just want to close with this. There are 3 easy things that you can do if you happen to care about the environment and you want to get people to vote more often. 1, promise to vote. You can do it at our website. If you sign this pledge to vote at environmentalvoter.org, we will send you election reminders whenever you have an election. Whenever. If you want to volunteer with us, you can text or call non-voting environmentalists around the country. You can sit on your couch in Branford and call non-voting environmentalists in Tampa, Florida, or in Phoenix, Arizona, wherever. We will train you easily online by webinar, and it is enormously simple. And the last thing I'll say is be a loud and proud environmental voter. We didn't get deep into the behavioral science research that we do and that others do, but I can guarantee you the greatest power any of you have is the fact that your peer groups look to you for cues. Oh, that you care about the environment. They want to know, oh, okay, well, I care about the environment too. What is Dan doing? And if you are loud and proud about the fact that voting, that being a voter is integral to how you express yourself as an environmentalist, that will have an enormous impact on your neighbors. Because the truth is, and literally thousands of behavioral science experiments have proven this, we never left the 4th grade playground. Like peer pressure and other social pressures define our behavior so much more than rational decision making. We like to think that we walk through each day making cost-benefit analyses, but the truth is, we walk through each day and most of our behavior is guided by how do we want people to view ourselves, or what is the best person me as, or my children to think of me as, or my neighbors to think of me as. And so you need to model good voting behavior to your peers. That, more than anything, will drive turnout. Thank you. Do not be discouraged. Under no circumstances are you allowed to leave this afternoon's presentation and say, oh, this Nathaniel Stinnett guy said environmentalists don't vote. We're all screwed. This is awful. Like, no, 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 no. This is actually very good news. I know it's frustrating to hear that all these environmentalists aren't voting, but if you care deeply about climate and the environment, believe me, bad news would be if I said, hey, we polled all these people and no one cares about climate change. That would be awful news, believe me. But that's not the case. Tens of millions of people already care so much about it that it's their #1 priority and they're just not voting. And that is a fixable problem. That's an eminently fixable problem. And so this is good news. We have this huge army of latent political power in the environmental movement just waiting to vote. And changing behavior is easier than changing minds. And the last thing is this. It's May 3rd. We are literally exactly 6 months away from the presidential election. 6 months from today, in a few hours, polls are going to start to close. You're going to be sitting down on your couches to watch election returns roll in. And you're probably feeling a little sick to your stomach like I am. Do that future you a favor and don't have any regrets. Whether you get involved with an organization like the Environmental Voter Project or another organization about issues that you care about or candidates that you care about, do it, because you're never going to get these next 6 months back. And getting people to vote is the only thing that changes policy. The only thing. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over by 5 minutes. I apologize.
Great. I can assure you, Nathaniel, if we were in person, you would be getting a resounding round of applause. So thank you so much. We have some very interesting questions come in. Maybe to just kick it off, when you say environmentalist, what do you mean? Or is that a general term that you leave up to the respondent to self-define themselves?
That's a great question. I'm glad that whoever asked it. There are obviously a million different ways to define an environmentalist, and our way is just as idiosyncratic as the other million ways. What we do is we have a very high bar for what it means to be targeted by us. We are only targeting someone if they don't just care about climate and the environment, but they prioritize it as their number one political issue over all other issues. Does that mean that if someone has the environment as their second most important issue, they're not an environmentalist? No, but as far as we're concerned at the Environmental Voter Project, we're really focusing on that tip of the spear. And so when I use that term, I recognize it is a very limiting definition of environmentalist, and it's just as idiosyncratic as any other choice that someone could make. We are talking about people who care so much about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority. And the reason we focus on them is because, again, it's cheaper and more efficient to not waste any of our time as an organization educating people and trying to change their minds or opinions. We want to get to people who, like, if you shake them awake at night, they scream climate change. Because if we get them to vote, they're going to drive policymaking. They're going to drive it at the federal level, but also the local and state level too. It's a great question.
There were two questions about the states, your 6 older states and the 6 ones you're working on now. How are those selected? Thanks. How are those selected? And aren't there discrepancies in the type of demographics that different states have available that ask the that ask the voters? So say a few words about that, please.
Another great question. So our number one criteria when choosing what states to work in is, where are there disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists? Because those are the states where we can have the biggest impact. So let me back up a little bit. Remember, I said, we are not in the election winning business. Believe me, as someone who's run a lot of campaigns myself before I started this nonprofit, talking to really bad voters is an awful way to win an election. If your only goal is to win one election on one Tuesday in November, by no means should you go and talk to all the non-voters. That would be an enormous waste of time. What we are doing is something the Environmental Voter Project is we've realized there are all of these non-voting environmentalists. And if we can just leverage this data science and this behavioral science to start getting large numbers of them to vote, well, we can completely change the electorate in certain states. We can change it so much that whenever anybody's running for federal or state or local office, they will poll likely voters and they'll say, holy moly, where did all these environmentalists come from? And so when we look at what states to work in, even though there are lots of politically important states that you'll see we are not working in, we need to go where we can have the biggest impact. So I'll give you an example. I don't think anybody would claim that Wisconsin is an unimportant state. It's important at the presidential level. It's important for other federal races. It's important at the state level. It's important at the local level. But you know what? There aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. And so no matter how good we are at what we do, the denominator of our target population is so small in Wisconsin that our work, even if we hit a home run every time there's an election, isn't going to move the dial much. Whereas in some of these other states, man, in Arizona, you could close your eyes and throw a rock and chances are you're going to hit a non-voting environmentalist in Arizona. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And so in these other states, there's just this enormous opportunity. And that's why we're in these 12 states.
So one of our participants said, when you mention contacting voters, what do you mean? As a long-term door-knocking volunteer, I can state unambiguously that most voters don't answer the door.
Yes. So we have 5 methods of contacting voters. Text message, phone call, door-to-door canvassing, direct mail, and digital advertisements. Now, we are kind of like the data nerds of the environmental movement and modern politics. We are going to end up running almost 100 randomized control trials this year, and we did almost 100 last year. We know which methods are the most effective. We know what time of day is the best time to do this. And whoever asked that question is absolutely right. Knocking on doors, well, now we can't knock on doors at all because there's a pandemic, but normally knocking on doors is not the most efficient because contact rates are very low. Usually you're lucky if you have a conversation with anywhere from 8 to 20% of the doors you knock on in a given turf. But even though canvassing isn't the most efficient, it is the most effective, by which I mean for every contact you make, so for every conversation you have, the likelihood of that person voting is you contact them in any other way: mail, text message, phone call, digital advertisement. So canvassing is a very, very important part of the political toolbox when there's not a... But the other things we use, phone calls, text messages, we are texting people. I mean, we probably text 30 to 40,000 non-voting environmentalists each day, because we have 3,000 volunteers around the country. Direct mail is much more powerful than most people think. Digital advertisements. So those are the 5 ways: canvassing, texting, calling, digital ads, direct mail.
Thank you. I think it was in the January Atlantic magazine, Eitan Hirsch had a summary of his book about political hobbyism. And I see you're nodding your head. Maybe some of our participants are not familiar with it. It's a profile of, I guess, largely liberal, white, college-educated people who would rather watch the news and complain and talk about the news rather than actually get involved politically, be it going to town meetings or even voting. So that kind of leads into another one of our questions: why don't environmentalists vote more often?
Great question. I am going to give you an honest and nuanced and well-researched and probably kind of disappointing answer. We don't know. We don't know, but it's not for lack of trying. And so let me give you the longer version of we don't know. Any social scientist, so not just behavioral scientists or economists or political scientists, but any social scientist can tell you that it is very easy to figure out why someone takes an action. What's hard is to do the opposite. What's really hard is to measure why someone does not vote or does not exercise. Because the only thing you can really do The only way anybody can measure why someone does not take an action is to ask them. And when you ask people, no matter how well designed your survey is, when you ask someone why they are not taking an action that society views favorably, they lie their pants off. They lie their pants off. And so it is enormously difficult to get an accurate understanding of why environmentalists aren't voting as often as other people, why other groups aren't voting as often as other people. We've tried. We've done very sophisticated ways to try to get around what's called response bias or survey bias problems. And what we'll do is we will poll groups of people, half of whom we know never vote, and the other half are perfect voters. They vote like all the time. And we've asked them all the same questions about civic engagement and politics and things like that. And even then, we can discern no difference between the people. And I'll give you an example. We ask the non-voters, do you think politicians care about the issues you care about? They say, no, they don't care. We ask the good voters, and they say, no, they don't care. We ask the good voters, do you think it's important to vote all the time? They say, oh yeah, it's really important to vote. We ask the non-voters, and they say, oh yeah, it's really important to vote. We ask the non-voters, do you think your one vote actually makes a difference? And they say, no, it doesn't make a difference. We ask the good voters, and they say, no, it doesn't make a difference. And so I can tell you the excuses that non-voters give for not voting. But the odd thing is that all those excuses also hold true for people who vote all the time. So we have no reason to believe that those excuses that people give for not voting are causally related to them not voting. Now, I will tell you the one thing that we do know, the one thing that you can actually, like one like hard nugget that you can take away from this response. Part of the environmental voter turnout problem is a demographic correlation. So when you look at people who don't just care about climate or the environment, but list it as their number one issue, they are much more likely to be people of color. So they're much more likely to be African Americans, Latinx, or Asian Americans. They are also more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. And they are slightly, but only slightly, more likely to be young rather than old. Now, what do those three groups have in common that I mentioned? Young people, people of color, and poorer people? They all vote less often than the rest of the population. But I said that's only part of the problem. And here's what's really going to screw with your head. When you only survey young people, the ones who care about the environment vote less often than other young people. When you only survey African Americans, the one who care about the environment vote less often than other African Americans. And so something else is going on there, and we don't know what it is. We can make some guesses, but I don't want to mislead you into thinking that they're anything other than guesses. Our best guess is that for decades, the environmental movement has conditioned people to think that the way to be a good environmentalist is through non-political actions. It's changing the way you eat. It's changing the way you get to work. It's recycling. It's changing how you consume energy, all of which are enormously important, don't get me wrong. But if you think about it, that's dramatically different from a whole host of other issues. I mean, if you care about civil rights, if you care about reproductive rights, if you care about guns, you view those things as inherently political. You view political action as being the highest form of engagement with that issue. Whereas environmentalists, for some reason, have never viewed the political arena as where they express themselves. But again, that's just a gut response. I don't want to mislead you into thinking that there's lots of research that shows this, because it's a really hard thing to figure out why people don't vote.
Are you able to distinguish in your polling the difference between an important issue and an emergency or an imminent issue? So for example, if you ask somebody on the street, what's the most important thing facing us right now, they might say COVID-19. On the other hand, if you say, what's the most important thing that will confront the country in the next 10 or 40 years, they're more likely to say climate change. So is there some way to kind of tease that out and reflect on the political behavior in terms of those two dimensions?
Yes, there is. We have not done it at the lately because this is such a fluid environment with COVID-19 that we don't want to waste money doing these huge predictive models like every 2 weeks. We want to get to a point where there's a little bit of sort of plateauing in how society views these things. But yes, you can absolutely tease these things out. But I want to be clear, and I think this is so, so important. Because of this revolution that happened, probably starting a little bit before 2000, where public voter files were digitized and software platforms allowed political campaigns to start searching everybody as individuals on voter files. Because of that, I can't stress to you enough how important it is that people who list climate or the environment as their top priority vote. Now, yes, there's a difference between sort of a short-term priority and a long-term priority and things like that, and that's important to mention. But simply preferring government action on climate change is not going to change policymaking, and here's why. 10 years ago, almost to the day, now 10 years ago in like maybe 2-3 months, I don't know, Barack Obama had to make a decision what to spend his political capital on. Was it going to be a price on carbon, or was it going to be universal or close to universal health care? Two very important things. I think reasonable people then certainly could have disagreed, and reasonable people now can disagree. But what there is no disagreeing on is that any president has a very, very limited amount of political capital, just like any mayor or governor or member of Congress has very limited political capital. And they need to decide what to spend it on. And they are not going to spend it on voters' sixth most important priority. They are not going to spend it on voters' fourth most important priority. What moves politicians is when large numbers of voters, not non-voters, but voters, demand action on something. And that's both good and bad news. And I want you to see the good news part of this. I mean, politics is actually a much more efficient marketplace than people give it credit for. It's just that the only marketplace that matters are voters and donors. But even donors are only good in that they help you get more votes. It all comes down to votes. And I think, I know we're getting towards the end here, but this is a really important point to put a button on. I think at a very deep level, many Americans are very cynical about politics. They think, oh, politicians will do whatever it takes to get elected. Yes, you're not wrong. I would just suggest to you that you need to take your cynicism one step further. If politicians will do what it takes to get elected, then that does not mean that your vote doesn't count. That means that your vote is actually the only thing that counts. It means that politicians go where the votes are. They go where the votes are, not because I'm some like cynical politico who says stuff like that, but because it's just like the basic arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician. It's how elections work. And so these things are enormously important. And yes, it is wonderful that so many Americans now prefer government action on climate change and the environment. But it is much, much more important that people who have it as their number one priority show up, because that will change everything. If we all woke up tomorrow morning and the front page of the New York Times said likely voters in the upcoming presidential election list climate as their number 2 priority, I suggest to you the whole world would change overnight. Because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Nothing. They go where the votes are.
Okay, well, we've come to the hour. It doesn't seem like so long, but it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I have two comments here that I would like to share with the group. One person said, "What a fascinating presentation by an excellent speaker." And I think we all share that sentiment. And somebody else from Phoenix, Arizona wrote, "Thank you for being in Arizona. There's plenty of room to move the needle here." So there you go. Thank you so much. And as I said before, if anybody is not on the Branford Forum mailing list, just send me a quick email and we'll make sure you get included. So thank you all for coming. And Nathaniel, thank you especially. It was fantastic. And we really appreciate your taking the time with us today.
Thank you for having me, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.